guys, my name's Natalie and welcome back to Crime Vlogs Weekly. I'm back. I took a little break just because I was burnt out and I needed an opportunity to do more research and to look at more cases, but I'm back and I'm ready to talk about all things murder. Serial killers are by far one of the most interesting to look at when it comes to the criminal world. The Yorkshire Ripper is one that I personally don't know a lot about, so I wanted to explore this case with you guys and do the research to understand how and why he did what he did. Now, the Yorkshire Ripper was a terrifying presence for anyone who lived through the 1970s, both in Yorkshire and the rest of Great Britain. His reign of terror would result in 13 deaths, all of which were women, and this spanned from around 1969, which was according to the killer, to around 1981 when he was eventually caught. Here in this modern day, we are flabbergasted that, you know, serial killers got away with this sort of stuff, but we have to remind ourselves that the technology and science wasn't around back then. It wasn't as good as it is now, and due to this lack of science and technology, serial killers like the Yorkshire Ripper would get away with their murders for years. So Peter Sutcliffe was born in Bingley in Yorkshire in 1969 to a working class family, and he was one of 6 brothers and sisters who all shared a 4-bed house, so it's very cramped. The area of Bingley today is considered to be a really nice area. It's surrounded by countryside and it's not too far from the moors, and I believe it's also an area that has since been updated to appeal to those who work in the city of Leeds and want to move out of the city. So Peter was considered to be a bit of a misfit from the very beginning. He didn't really have a lot of friends and was considered a little bit of a loner. His dad would say that Peter was quite detached from the other kids at school, and that even like in the schoolyard at lunch he would separate himself from everyone and remain in like a small area of the schoolyard for the entirety of lunch on his own. He left school at the age of 15 with no qualifications, and from then he would go from job to job, which morbidly included being a gravedigger. Now, back in the 1940s and 50s, when he was a young kid, he was described as being a mummy's boy. He would always cling to the skirt of Kathleen, his mother, and it's said that there was sort of a rejection from his dad at the beginning, who was quite sports mad. He was a Yorkshireman, he was quite masculine in the way he was, and to him, Peter was this small, timid individual, and he sort of didn't really have much of a relationship, I think, with his dad, not so much the close relationship that other kids tend to have. Now, this to me seems a bit cruel because obviously society and the attitudes towards masculinity have changed a lot since then, but that was part of the time that they were in, and things were very different back then. As a teenager working as a gravedigger, his colleagues would say that he had quite a morbid sense of humour when it came to being on the job and talking about the work that they were doing in a weird way. He would often make practical jokes about the work that he was doing, and on some occasions he even took the rings from dead bodies and would give them as presents to people, which is just odd. But for the first time in his life, Peter had friends, and he would go down to the local boozer called the Royal Standard with these friends and have a few drinks every now and then. This was in Bradford's red light district, and it was at the Royal Standard that he would actually meet his wife Sonia in 1966. During this time, he went from working as a gravedigger to working as a truck driver, which made it very convenient for him to be away for long periods of time and to also be across the country, which for a killer is very convenient. As far as we know, officially the first murder took place on the 30th of October 1975, and that woman was Wilma McCann. Wilma McCann was 28 years old and she had 4 children. She'd left that evening to go to the pub and clubs, and she would meet Peter Sutcliffe on the way back walking home after she accepted a lift from him. So it would soon become apparent to the police that Peter Sutcliffe had a type, or the Yorkshire Ripper had a particular type of women that he would go for, and these were prostitutes. And this hatred to prostitutes would sort of blur his decision making on who he would pick to kill, because there were a few times in the case of Wilma McCann and a few others where they had no links to prostitution. As far as the police know, they weren't prostitutes, they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, with Wilma McCann, for some unknown reason, whether she thought it was appropriate to sort of offer this to him for giving her a lift home, she offered him business. Peter agreed to this, and they pulled up in some playing fields. They got out of the car, and just as they were about to do this business, Peter struck McCann over the head several times with a hammer. And it wasn't until the next morning when McCann's body would be found by a milkman. Again, many of the victims were sex workers, but there were cases where they weren't, and that Peter had gotten it wrong. And this kind of put a lot of terror into both Yorkshire and the entirety of Great Britain, because they suddenly were aware that, okay, he was killing sex workers, but now he's killing people who aren't sex workers, so no women are safe. Now, as you've already seen, I've shown the victims of the Yorkshire Ripper, and I feel like there's a lot of stories that need to be told, and I'd be more than happy to do individual videos further down the line. The victims varied in age from 16 all the way to 47. There were no distinguishing features that sort of made them similar, other than the fact that a lot of them were sex workers. Now, it would take a long time for the police to catch Peter Sutcliffe, because he managed to evade the police on several occasions. Unfortunately, what is similar with many serial killer cases is that the police often get a lot of hoax calls, a lot of people pretending to be the killer themselves. They even got a voice recording of someone saying that they were the killer, so it kind of really threw them off course a number of times. Police have to follow every line of inquiry, whether they believe it is legit or not. The first break in the case would be in 1977, when one of the victims, Jean Jordan, had a £5 note found in her handbag. Now, this £5 note was traced back to the original bank that it came from, and they had said that this would have been part of someone's wages. Now, this number was around 8,000 people, and the police amazingly managed to interview 5,000 of those individuals, which included Peter Sutcliffe, but he had given an alibi that he was at a family party, which kind of made sense. The police had said this was seen as credible, so I'm not quite sure what that means, but he had an alibi. There were also times where his vehicle was spotted in the areas where the murders took place, and although the police brought him in, he always tended to have an alibi, and there was not enough evidence, and his wife Sonia would actually back him up on several occasions with alibis. So the police would eventually arrest him for drunk driving in April of 1980, but whilst he was awaiting trial, he would go on to kill 2 other women and attack 3 others. It wasn't until January of 1981 that he would be charged with the murders after detailing his crimes. Peter told the police that this all started when he was a gravedigger, and he'd apparently heard a mysterious voice coming from one of the graves of a Polish man. For him, this would later transpire that this was the voice of God, and that it was his duty to get rid of society's ills, which were prostitutes. Peter Sutcliffe was found guilty of all 13 murders, and he was given 20 consecutive life sentences. And he would actually die of coronavirus in 2020. Now, even though I'm fascinated by serial killers, the actions of Peter Sutcliffe are beyond terrible. It's a shame that these sex workers, who for the most part were doing it to keep a roof over their heads, had to have their lives taken in such a brutal way. You know, these women who were trying to support themselves and to support their families, of which some had children. It's unfortunate that there's that same stigma today in some way for sex workers. Peter Sutcliffe obviously had a problem from a young age. Maybe this was a chemical imbalance that made him this way from birth. After his arrest, he was later diagnosed by the doctors as having paranoid schizophrenia, which can obviously make you hear voices, and that's probably why he was hearing this voice telling him to kill. It's unfortunate that back then they didn't have the same systems that we now have in place for mental health and illnesses, and that maybe if they were there back then, he would have gotten the help that he needed, and maybe none of this would have even happened. Many serial killers I have looked at, you can kind of put them in similar boxes, and with Peter Sutcliffe, it's not necessarily about nurture for him, it's more so about the mental health illness that he had. Even though his relationship with his dad wasn't a great one, I don't think it was an influence in his decision to kill. The montage of the victims at the beginning is something that I kind of want to do with all the serial killers that I cover, because I think it's important to give them the spotlight, because often enough victims don't get the spotlight in the same way that the serial killers do. And that if any of you guys want to hear more about the victims of the Yorkshire Ripper, I will be more than happy to do individual videos on them in the future. Do let me know in the comments below what you think about the case, and let me know if I've missed anything in my research. Make sure to also let me know what cases you'd like me to cover in the next video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, clicking that bell notification to get notified of whenever I post my next video, and I will see you guys next week. Bye guys!